Okay.
Today's daf is daf Gimel, and we'll begin on the fourth line. At the end of the fourth line, this is where we stopped yesterday, V'ema Atzeres. And the Gemara is continuing to analyze the statement of Rabbi Yochanan that in the Pasuk in the 8th chapter of Vayikra, when it says L'chaper, in the parsha of Miluim, the Karbanos of Miluim, we interpret the word L'chaper as referring to the Prisha of the Kohen Gadol 1 week before Yom Kippur. And the Gemara back on Daf Beis had raised the objection, maybe the word L'chaper is referring to a Chiyuv Prisha before Chag HaSukkos, or maybe before Chag HaPesach, but not before Yom Kippur. And the Gemara answered that the similarity between Karbanos Miluim and Yom Kippur is very striking, because in both cases, there's a preach of 7 days in advance of 1 day of Avodah. Then in the case of Miluim, they were poresh in order to prepare for that first day, Hakamas HaMishkan, Rosh Chodesh Nisan, and in the case of Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol will prepare for 7 days for that 1 day of Yom Kippur. Whereas in the case, for example, of Chag HaSukkos, there would be a case of preacha of 7 days for 7 days, because Sukkot lasts for 7 days. So the Gemara says, V'yema Atzeres. But what about Shavuos? The Prishas Shiva L'Yom Echad. If we were to be Poresh the Kohen before Shavuos, that would be 7 days of preacha for 1 day of Shavuos. Rabbi Abba, Donin Par Echad V'ayel Echad Mi Par Echad V'ayel Echad Lafuki Atzeres Dishnei Elim Ninhu. Rabbi Abba says there's a striking comparison between Miluim and Yom Kippur as opposed to Shavuos, because in the case of Yom Kippur, the Karbanos of Musaf are Par Echad V'ayel Echad. And in a parallel way, Shmini L'Miluim is also Par Echad V'ayel Echad, meaning Aaron HaKohen brought Par Echad V'ayel Echad. So the Karbanos are a mirror image, one or the other, if we compare Yom Kippurim to Miluim. Whereas in the case of Atzeres, of Chag HaShavuos, the Karbanos are Shnei Elim, that are the accompaniment of the Shtei Alechem. The special carbon of Chag HaShavuos of Atzeres is the Shtei Alechem, which was accompanied not by 1 aisle, but by 2 Elim. So in that sense, we really have a striking comparison between Miluim, which is Par Echad V'ayel Echad, and Yom Kippurim, which is likewise Par Echad V'ayel Echad. Whereas Atzeres is 2 Elim. The Gemara says, wait a minute, you're really stepping into a kind of a minefield, because Hanicha, that makes sense. Leman Yoma, this is the opinion of Rebbe, who says that on Yom Kippurim, Ayel Echad, we only bring 1 aisle, and that makes it absolutely parallel to Miluim, where there's 1 aisle. El Leman Yomar, however, Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon disagrees with Rebbe, and he holds that the Karban Musaf of Yom Kippurim consists of Shnei Eilim Ninhu, Mai Ikol Meimar. How you can explain, therefore, and justify that the parallel to Parshas Miluim is Yom Kippurim and not Shavuos, because in both Yom Kippur and Shavuos, according to Rabbi Elazar, we're talking about 2 Eilim, whereas in Miluim, we're talking about 1 aisle. So that striking comparison is completely off. Now, let's take a minute or two just to understand the machlokes between Rebbe and Rabbi Elazar. There seems to be a very odd machlokes at face value, whether Yom Kippurim requires 2 Elim in the Karban Musaf or 1 aisle. And the Gemara now is going to quote a brisa, which is going to really shed a light on this machlokes. The Sanya, this brisa, which is also a Taurus Kohen in Parshas Achrimos, points out that with regard to the carbon tzibur of Yom Kippurim, there are two parshios in the Torah. The first parsha, which is the Seder Avodas HaYom Kippurim, is in Chumash Vayikra in Parshas Achrei Mos. But secondly, if you fast forward to the end of Sefer Bamidbar in Parshas Pinchas, there the Torah repeats a set of karbonos that are brought with the Musaf, for the Musaf of Yom Kippurim, and therefore we wonder whether or not the aisle that's mentioned in Parshas Pinchas is the same aisle that was mentioned earlier in Parshas Achrei Mos. Rabbi Omer aisle echadu. Both parshios should be combined, meaning it's a repetition. And ha'amar kan hu ha'amar b'chumash pekudim. The same aisle that's mentioned in Achrei Mos, quote, the aisle echad li'ola, is the same identical aisle that's mentioned in Parshas Pinchas, where the Torah says, "Ve'kravtem ola l'Hashem," referring to Yom Kippurim, "Reach nichoach par ben bakar echad aisle echad kvasim b'nei shana shivat v'miyulachem." So we have two parshios here, and Rebbe insists that they're really one and the same. That when it says in Parshas Achrei Mos that together with the Seirei Izim Lechatas, you should bring an Ayal Echad Ola, that's the same Ola that is mentioned in Parshas Pinchas, meaning in Parshas Pinchas, according to Rebbe, the Torah is reviewing the various Musafim of the various Yomim Tovim. And it just reiterates what we know already from Parshas Achrei Mos, namely that there's an Ola, there's an Ayal, that's brought together with the Shiva Kvasim and so forth and so on of the Karban Musaf. And therefore, at the end of the day, Yom Kippurim, according to Rebbe, requires a Musaf of Ayal Echad and Par Echad. And the Gemara now is completely oblivious to the Shiva Kvasim. The other commentaries here are bothered by the fact that there seems to be a distinction between Maluim and Yom Kippur in terms of the Shiva Kvasim, but at least as far as the overlap of Ayal Echad and Par Echad, that we have, according to Rebbe, a mirror image of both Miluim and Yom Kippur. But Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon Omer, the Brisa records the dissenting view of Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. Shnei Elim Heim. These are two separate parshios and two separate Elim. And on Yom Kippurim, they brought two Elim as part of the carbon tzibur of Yom Kippurim. Echad Omer Kan, one that's mentioned here in Parshas Achrei Mos, where it says Me'es Kol Adat Me'es Adas Bnei Yisrael Yikru Yikach etc. V'ayal Echad Yola, and Echad Omer B'chumash Pekudim, and the parsha of Karbonos Musafim in Parshas Pinchas, where it says V'kravtem Ola Lashem etc. Ayal Echad etc. That's a different ayal, which means that according to Rabbi Elazar, there are actually two Elim that are brought on Yom Kippur. So if that be the case, we don't understand why Rabbi Yochanan insists on interpreting the word lechaper in the Parsha Miluim as referring dafka to Yom Kippurim. Where is the striking resemblance between Miluim and Yom Kippurim when Miluim is one aisle and Yom Kippurim is two? And you objected to interpret lechaper as referring to a Prisha before Chag HaShavuos, because in Chag HaShavuos we have two Elim. Well, guess what? According to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon, even on Yom Kippur you have two Elim. So what makes the preference to Yom Kippurim as opposed to Shavuos? And the Gemara answers, Afilu Tamer Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon. Even though I agree that according to Rabbi Elazar Reb Shimon on Yom Kippurim there were makriv two Elim for the carbon tzibur, exactly like in Shavuos. But nevertheless, it's more logical to assume an equation between Miluim and Yom Kippurim as opposed to Miluim and Chag HaShavuos, because Hasam, there on Yom Kippurim, these two Elim are two different Elim, meaning they're essentially two different categories of karbanos, although they're both in Hayel, but there's no combination. There's no correlation between the two because chad lechovos hayom and chad lemusafin. And the Gemara is now making a very fundamental distinction that there's something called chovos hayom. There are certain korbanos that are very unique to Yom Kippurim, and this is something, a theme that's going to take us throughout almost the entire Masechet Yoma, that there are korbanos that belong and are generated by Yom Kippur as chovos hayom, as unique korbanos of Yom Kippurim, as opposed to a whole bunch of korbanos that are brought on Yom Kippur, not because of Yom Kippur, but because it's a day like any other day in the year, and it's got an endowment of Kedushas Hayom. It has its own Karbanos Musaf. So within the context of Karbanos Musaf, Rabbi Loza says you have to bring an aisle because Yom Kippur is no worse than any other day that's sanctified with Kedushas Hayom that requires a Musaf, and the aisle is part of the Musaf. But the aisle of Parshas Achrimos is an aisle of Chovos Hayom. That's an aisle that has nothing to do with Yom Kippur's generic character, but rather with its specific character, its own unique personality as Yom Kippur. And I was thinking, in order to clarify this, we could suggest the following nafkamina. Again, this requires a lot more research. But I would say off the top of my head that when it comes to the Musafim and the aisle that was brought within the context of Parshas Pinchas, the Kohen Gadol would wear big zav like he wore the rest of the year. Masha Ein came when it came to the aisle that was brought by Parshas Achrimos as part of the Avodas Hayom, Chovos Hayom. There, the Kohen Gadol would wear big lavon. And even if it's not exactly true, you have to really go through the sugyas exactly which karbanos require big lavon and which big zav. But nevertheless, conceptually, they're two different machayv. And therefore, when you're talking about the musaf of Yom Kippurim as a musaf service, it's one aisle. Lafuke atzeres, but atzeres has, as an accompaniment to the Shtei Lechem, another additional aisle, and instead of bringing one aisle, there are two elim, the travayu chovos hayom ninu, and the one entity of one carbon that's comprised of two elim, that, as we said before, accompany the Shtei Lechem of atzeres, and therefore it's more logical to establish an analogy between Miluim requiring Prisha of 7 days and Yom Kippur requiring 7 days than it is to create an analogy between Miluim and Chag HaShavuos. Because again, as far as the Chovos Hayom is concerned, Shavuos has two Eilim. Miluim has only one aisle. And as far as the Chovos Hayom of Yom Kippur, it's only one aisle, and that makes it similar to the Miluim. So Morias V'Yema Rosh Hashanah. Why not postulate that the Pasuk L'chaper requiring Prisha in a carbon similar to Miluim is referring to 7 days before Rosh Hashanah. The Prisha Shiva Yom Echad, who we have all the advantages that you want, and a perfect analogy to Miluim. Number one, like Miluim, it's 7 days preparing for 1 day, because Rosh Hashanah is only 1 day on a Daraisa. And number two, we have only one aisle on Rosh Hashanah, which means that this Par Echad, aisle Echad, and Rosh Hashanah, therefore, seems to be a perfect candidate for an analogy to Miluim. Rabbi Avo says, what's the advantage of Yom Kippur over Rosh Hashanah? Banin par v'ayil shalom, mipar v'ayil shalom. Uki atzeres Rosh Hashanah ditzibur ninu. What's unique about Yom Kippur, and makes it strikingly similar to Miluim, is the fact that the Torah requires that the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippurim bring his own par and his own aisle, as opposed to anything that we find in Shavuos and Rosh Hashanah, where the Kohanim brought the karbanos of Shavuos and Rosh Hashanah from the communal chest. These were classic karbanos tzibur that were purchased from the Trumas HaLishka. Those monies, which were earmarked for karbanos tzibur, were used for the karbanos of both Rosh Hashanah and Shavuos. But on Yom Kippur, we have something very unique. and it parallels miluim, and that is that the Torah requires a par v'ayil shalom. Mishalom means from the Kohen Gadol. He has to dig into his own pocket and purchase a par and purchase an aisle. And this is based on a pasuk in Parshas Achrimos. Bizos yavo Aaron el HaKodesh, bepar ben bakar lechatos, v'ayil li olah. And that means par v'ayil shalom. And that's exactly a mirror image of what we learned in Miluim, where the Torah says, "Vayomer al Aaron kach lecha egel ben bakar lechatos v'ayil li olah." The par and the ayil are lecha. Lecha means mishalcha. It's got to be your money. You have to pay the check from your bank account, just like we saw in the case of Yom Kippur. So in both Yom Kippurim and in Miluim, we're talking about an ayil. We're talking about a par that comes from the bank account of the Kohen Gadol. Aaron in the case of Miluim, and the Kohen Gadol in Yom Kippurim. That's not the case, neither with regard to Atzeres, being Shavuos, nor with regard to Shana, where the monies for these karbanos are communal funds. Now the Gemara says, but once again, you're entering into a minefield, because is this the din, in fact, that on Yom Kippurim the Kohen Gadol has to pay from his own pocket in order to purchase the par in the aisle? Oh, Nicha, that makes sense. You're correct, Laman Omar. That's Rav Yoshia, who holds that whenever it says in the Torah, Kach Lecha, like for example in Miluim, we say the pasuk says, Vayomer la'Aaron, Kach Lecha, Egel ben Bakal Chatzai Lel Pirucho. What do we understand to mean? Mishalcha. The word Lecha means that you have to buy the carbon with your own mama. And another phrase which is very similar to Kach Lecha is, as we turn to the Gaf Gimel Amid Beis, Asei Lecha. Like for example, in the Parsha of Chatzotzos, in Baloscha, it says, Asei Lecha Shtei Chatzotzos Kesef, and we interpret it as Mishalcha. And therefore, it has to be brought from his private funds, Kach Lecha and Asei Lecha. And therefore, karbanos of Miluim have to come and have to be purchased from the pocket, private monies of Aaron. And therefore, Yom Kippurim is very, very similar, strikingly similar to Miluim, like we saw earlier in Rabbi Avo, that even Yom Kippurim, the para and the ayil, comes from the private monies of the Kohen Gadol. So all this works out very beautifully according to the Shita of Rabbi Avo. As we said, there's a striking similarity between Miluim, where Aaron has to pay for his own Harvi Ayil, and Yom Kippurim, where the same is true. The Kohen Gadol has to dig into his own pocket. That fits in very, very beautifully.